So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's Wednesday webinar from Birkett Long. Birkett Long, as you will have seen, are offering a series of webinars every Wednesday, with the exception of school holidays, focusing on issues for individuals, families and businesses. Today, myself, Julie Temple, is being joined by Jonathan Perlmutter. Myself, I'm head of the BLHR and employment team, and I will be talking today about issues around flexible working and restructuring as we move into the post-lockdown phase. Jonathan is going to be talking to you a little bit later on around recognising and realising your intangible assets to drive growth. I'm hoping I'll understand what that means by the end of what he's talking about. We will take questions at the end. By experience, there's likely to be one or two, and I don't want to delay Jonathan doing his little bit in terms of my part. And also, just so that you are aware, a copy of the notes will be sent out to you that I'm running through. I'm just going to be touching on things in a very light touch way, and the notes will include a lot more detail. So they'll be sent out after the event along with a recording for you. There'll also be a quick link to a survey, which is very short, and we'd very much appreciate for you to fill that out for us if you could. You are all muted. If for some reason we lose the technology and you become unmuted at some point, if I could just ask you to make sure that you remute yourself, it will just help to minimise any background noise and distractions that we might have. There is a shortcut key, which I've learnt through presenting these. So it's Control, Shift and M, which should help you toggle through. Please don't test it. But if you do lose it, that's the quick way, hopefully, to get it back. So moving into my part of the presentation, and I will bring up my notes just in case I lose where I am. We are moving into, as I mentioned before, a post-lockdown phase for businesses. Not particularly relevant for what I'm saying today, but the notes the information in the notes is relevant and up to date to the 31st of May. So please do check out for some updates. There was a update to the furlough scheme, and the notes do include that. I'm not going to talk in any detail about that, but it is relevant as we look at the flexible working point, which I will deal with in a little while. So returning to the, in quotes, new normal, which is a phrase that many of us, I'm sure, have heard. I've got on the slides, which hopefully Jen's going to put up next, three phrases that I have heard in recent weeks. The first one is for us to carefully consider which parts of the previous normal are worth looking back to or rushing back to. So please do have a think about that as you're looking and planning for the future. Also, two quotes there from two people that I've sort of idolised over the years, JFK and Sir Winston Churchill. JFK, apparently, I've not checked it, but the Chinese word for crisis comprises two characters. First is danger, which is quite obvious, and the other is opportunity. And again, I'd invite you to think about the opportunities that the return to new normal might present for you and your businesses, which links in quite nicely, I think, with what Jonathan might be talking about a little bit later on. So as we look to the new normal and what challenges and issues you might face as a business and in relation to your employees, The three top ones there are the ones that I'm going to be quickly looking at and highlighting some of the key points for you. So, as a consequence of the situation in which you may have found yourself in, I suspect many of you will have a number of employees working from home. Many of you may have a good number of employees placed onto furlough, so they're not working, but you are still being required to meet a proportion of their salaries. Others might be unwell or whatever the case may be. But as a consequence of that big shift, you may well find that you have an ability or a wish to restructure your business into the future. That may or may not involve changes to terms and conditions. It may or may not involve redundancies. And we'll quickly have a look at each of those issues. Some of you may have started already to receive requests for flexible working. I know that a good number of clients of ours have already started to see that filter through, and I'm sure that you will already all be aware of the big Twitter news that Twitter were not going to be requiring their employees to return to the workplace. There's going to be some other issues around recruitment and perhaps absence management, capability, performance, as people struggle to adapt to whatever the new normal might look like, and particularly if they've been on furlough and out of the business, or they've been working from home for a considerable period of time. So if we have a quick look at what a redundancy process might look like, we've got set out on the slide there an overview of what a best practice redundancy process might look like. I'm not going to talk through each of those steps. The notes do include much more detail within them to help guide you through. I'm simply going to flag a couple of key points for you to think about. The first one is, what is a redundancy? That can be quite straightforward. A redundancy can take place if the business is closing entirely, and I'm afraid we are starting to see some of that come through. It might also be where a particular place is closing within the business. So if there are a number of locations within the business, and for whatever reason you decide to close one or two or more of those, then that would be a redundancy. Alternatively, you might have a number of redundancies within a particular place, but of roles rather than places. In the first two, so the whole business is closing or where the place of work is closing, that's quite straightforward. You're likely to just be targeting those people who are employed at those places. If, however, you're selecting roles, and this becomes more complicated if there are more than one or more roles and not all are affected, then you might have to carry out a selection process. And as I say, there's some more details in the notes around how you might want to and might need to go about that process. Moving on to step 3 there, very important to remember that if you are considering making redundant or changing the terms and conditions of 20 or more employees at a particular location, or in the words of the statute, establishment, then you will have to comply with collective consultation obligations. That is not a straightforward process, and it does mean that you have a fixed period of time during which you have to complete a consultation process with, in theory, elected representatives. So if you're talking about 20 or more and it's less than 100, that process has to take place over 30 days. If you're talking about 100 or more, then that process has to take place over 45 days. The other important point for you to think about is the requirement to file a HR1 form with the Secretary of State. That has to be done before notice of dismissal is given, and failure to do that, and this is a big one, is a criminal offence. So it's not something to be missed. So please do bear that particular point in mind, and it might be something that you will need to seek advice on in the future. Now, that can be obviously from your own advisors if you have them, or if you're already a client of ours or want to discuss that with us, then we'd be very happy to talk about it. Regardless of whether there is a collective consultation process, you will still have to individually inform and consult with your staff in the vast majority of cases. So that process will run alongside the individual process that would have to take place otherwise. And as a general rule of thumb, that will include placing the individuals at risk, inviting them to a meeting to discuss that, to give them an opportunity to put forward alternative proposals, to then consider what they might have put forward, perhaps have a second meeting, reach a decision and notify them, and then have an appeal process. So as I say, that is a best practice redundancy process. Some of those steps you might be able to omit, some of those steps you might be able to circumvent a little bit, or at least comply with to a lesser or greater degree, depending on what is necessary. As I say, more details in the notes. It's a similar process in relation to changing terms and conditions, but there is a couple of other points to think about as part of that process. So as we look on the slide there's a sort of decision tree to take you through the process that you would have to follow, and this comes in at the preparation stage. So you've identified a potential need to make changes to terms and conditions of employment for your staff. That might be the times that they work, the hours that they work. It might be their rate of pay. It might be removing some sort of benefit that they've previously been that they've had the benefit of. So in terms of preparation, the first thing to do is to identify what terms and conditions apply. What are they entitled to under the contract, and what change do you want to introduce? Some contracts will allow for changes. Some contracts will allow for a reasonable change in the place of work, for example, in which case you might be able to go to your staff and say, in Birkett Long's example, for the sake of argument, Julie, instead of working at our Colchester office, we would like you to move to our Chelmsford office. Oh, and by the way, we have a right in your contract that allows us to do that, and we are exercising that right. Now, as a matter of law, generally speaking, that's fine. As a matter of employee relations, I would suggest that you perhaps approach it in a slightly different way, whilst mentioning you have the right to make the change, trying to bring the employee along and trying to encourage their agreement. Because if you are forcing a change on them, they are not likely to be perhaps as compliant as they might otherwise be. So as with all of these things, there's always a legal approach and a employee relations approach. If your contract doesn't allow for changes, and I'm going to venture that the sorts of changes you will want to make coming up are unlikely to be provided for in your contracts in the vast majority of cases, I would suggest, in the same way as you, even if you have the contractual right, you do explain what the change is. You explain the reasons for the change, as I recommend you would do where you have the right to change, and you try and get the employee to agree. Now, I think currently you have the best chance of introducing changes as you will ever have now, which isn't to say that you should take this as an opportunity to make quite draconian changes that perhaps aren't necessary. You should be looking at the changes that you need to make to give your business the future viability, or the best future viability in the current situation. Trying to get your employees' agreement is going to be key, because the alternatives are not particularly appealing. The alternatives are that you dismiss the individual and you offer them an alternative, well, you offer them the same role but on the new terms that you want to introduce. That carries with it a risk, particularly if they have 2 years service or more, because they will have been dismissed and you will have to potentially justify your decision in an employment tribunal. So that's not appealing. The alternative is that you impose the change and then you might find that you have an employee sitting there saying, well, I don't agree to that change. And perhaps the change was to work 3 days a week on a Monday, a Wednesday and a Friday. And the individual continues to turn up at work on a Tuesday and a Thursday. And that's obviously going to be a practical headache for you, as well as the issues around pay. So trying to get agreement and trying to encourage and explain is going to be important there. The final point there is collective consultation, which I touched on earlier. If you're making changes to terms and conditions, that does potentially fall within the definition of redundancy for the purposes of collective consultation, which is wider than the normal phraseology. So I've just put that on there to remind you that you might need to comply with that. Very briefly, I'll talk about layoff and short-time working, which is going to apply in most instances after the closure of the furlough scheme. Layoff gives employers the right to send employees home with no work and no pay. I would not recommend, even if you have the contractual right to do that, that you do that currently because of the existence of the furlough scheme. Similarly, short-time working, you will have the right, if you have a contractual term to this effect, you can arrange for short-time, part-time working for individuals, and in the legislative sense, that's where the pay that they're entitled to receive for that is less than half a week's pay. I mention that in the context of moving forward, and as I say, certainly in terms of layoff post 31st of October, short-time working perhaps is going to be useful for you if you're looking at flexible furlough from the 1st of July. Anyone who is laid off and on short-time working will have a right to a guarantee payment, which is 5 workless days in a 3-month period, so a maximum of £150. Obviously, that's a massive difference between furlough and the furlough payments and what is the statutory guarantee payment, but just to flag that to you. Also, in certain circumstances, the individual will be entitled to a redundancy payment, and as I say, that the details where that might arise are on the screen, and more details in the notes, which you'll be able to get later. So moving on to flexible working, I'd be interested to know actually if any of you have had any flexible working requests as yet. But just to flag to you, there's 2 main points I want to make to you in relation to flexible working. The first one is to give you an overview of the statutory scheme. The statutory scheme gives the right to employees who have worked for you for 26 weeks at least to make a flexible working request. That can be for any reason. The request has to be made in writing and it has to comply with certain requirements, including stating that it is made under the statutory scheme. When the right was initially introduced, it was quite a complex and laborious process, but we now have a simplified process that must be completed within 3 months of the date of the request, ending with the appeal. So you have to have all of that completed within a 3-month period. It can be extended by agreement, and I emphasise by agreement because of course employees might not be particularly compliant with that particular issue. In certain circumstances, employees can bring a claim in relation to a statutory flexible working request, and an important point at the bottom there, only one request can be made in any 12-month period. So it is useful, if you can, to try and encourage an employee to make the flexible working request under the statutory scheme, and then you can say, no, you've made one, off you go, we're not going to consider it. That said, I'm hoping businesses will be perhaps a bit more embracing of the changes that we've seen, and perhaps a little less resistant to the requests for flexible working you might receive. Under the statutory scheme, there are 8 reasons that you can refuse a flexible working request, and they're listed on the screen. I would challenge any of you to not be able to find a reason to refuse a request if you were minded to. Ultimately, it's a very broad ability to say no. However, the ultimate point to remember is that it's not just the statutory flexible working request that you need to consider. It is a question of other potential claims that individuals can bring. And I'll come on to my final slide now. So we're talking about potential discrimination claims. So if, for example, a flexible working request is being made in relation to, for example, childcare issues, then that is something that you will have to be wary of. Also, you need to think about the fact that individuals might raise grievances if they're unhappy about the decision. Now, when I was travelling at the start of lockdown, I happened to be listening to the radio, and the presenter particularly passed a comment on the fact that obviously a large number of businesses over a large number of years will have been refusing requests to work from home. And of course, almost overnight, a large population of the workforce has been forced into that situation. And if you are going to be thinking about refusing working from home requests in the future, you need to be very, very clear about why, because you are inevitably potentially going to have grievances. Also, potentially people might resign and bring claims for constructive dismissal. So that's a whistle-stop tour about around some of the issues you might face. As I say, more details in the notes, and we'll be answering questions at the end. So I'll pass you across to Jonathan, who's going to be talking to you about intangible assets.
Hello, can you all hear me all right? I hope so. Good. Right, yes, so what I'm going to talk about today is what one might do to take advantage of changes, as per the Churchill quotation that Julie had at the beginning of her presentation, and perhaps pivot one's business and then take advantage of intellectual property rights in order to consolidate that pivot. So without further ado, if I could have the next slide, please. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up into 3 pieces. I'm going to draw attention to what discourse is and how social trends are manifest in the media. I'm going to have a look at the relationship between that discourse and the characteristics of IP a bit. And I'm also going to have a look at what other clients have been doing, which I've noted and thought clever and ingenious and resourceful, and then maybe invite you to think about what you might do in terms of your own pivoting and in terms of your embracing of commercial opportunities. So can I have the next slide? And all in all, what I want to do is provide you with some inspiration. Next, please. So I've created this little green model here. It's in COVID-19 viral green, which is also Birkett Long green. And I've called it an axis of discourse. And I think that you can view discourse on change in some negative ways and some positive ways. So, and then you can act in either a negative way or a positive way. So on the one hand, we can look to move towards what we used to know as quickly as possible, and we can cleave to that. And that may tend to lead us to view disruption as an entirely negative thing, which has only a poor effect on our business. And that may lead us to panic and despair. However, it may be the case that one can look at various things happening in politics, in the economy, and in society, and see that although people do want to return to what they know before, changes are also going to occur. And if we view some of those changes, albeit brought about by negative circumstances, as positive, we may be able to see opportunities. And even if those changes are negative, we may be able to see ways of ameliorating those negative effects and helping with the effort to move towards normality and to help others. So may I have the next slide, please? Next, please. So let me just have a quick talk about discourse. And what I want to do is define it, and excuse the large amount of text on this slide. But for me, discourse is speech and text on a given issue. So people see an issue and they write something about it, having formed an opinion on it. And then that utterance, which might be a speech utterance, or it might increasingly be a textual utterance on social media or in the more traditional media, will give that issue some new shape. And so we can say that discourse reflects social trends because it's a result of what people have seen, but also that it shapes social trends because it's formative of opinion. Now, with discourse, we can say that whether we agree or disagree, in terms of the potency it may have, it's inherently valid. So if people believe things and they act on it, the discourse has a potency, whether we find that discourse to be true or not. And whilst things may have a truth value, they also have a commercial value. And it's those commercially useful discourses that I'm most interested in highlighting. So I've also noted that whilst we're on lockdown, we're obviously all spending a lot more time looking at the computer, you know, and particularly when we haven't been able to go out and see our friends so much. And I think that that's increased the importance of these discursive channels, the print media, what's online, what we see on the TV, and that's had an enhanced potency and ability to shape the way we've been thinking about things, you know, and sometimes it's caused a great deal of stress and sadness. At other times it's galvanized us into collective action, like the clapping for the NHS, for example. And a lot of that discourse and a lot of that media experience that we've been having has substituted real lived and interpersonal experience for the time. So at least for this time, it's become, in my view, more important. And I also think that without ignoring the very clear negatives, we need to look at those changes and see if there are any opportunities in them. And also take a view as to whether we are seeing things which are you know, evanescent, very short-lived changes and micro trends, or whether we're seeing things that are going to endure. And if we are able to identify these online trends which explode suddenly or which are likely to endure for a long time, and harness them, then there's a potential to do something that's commercially fruitful around those things. And I think that that will be helpful for people in times of economic recovery, which we must surely be entering at this stage. Next slide, please. Just to cleanse your palate, as it were, from that very wordy slide, I just want to give you an example. And the example is obviously very close to our hearts, and that's toilet paper. Of course, when we were first put into lockdown, all of a sudden there was all this discourse about toilet paper shortages. And although the best of us, and I count myself among the very best of us, did try and restrain ourselves from buying additional toilet paper, I would think the majority of us could look into our souls and into our hearts and say that we did rush out and we did buy additional toilet paper because we thought it was going to run out. And of course there were shortages, but they were caused by the discourse of shortage. And so you had this loop of discourse and action and more discourse and more action, because of course once people started panic buying toilet paper, the media went down there and they took films of it, and then all of a sudden panic buying was happening. Anthony Giddens, a sociologist, actually wrote about this, and he called it a double hermeneutic. And without wanting to get into obscure sociological terms like that, what it means is when people see something and they act it, and it creates a feedback loop with the thing that they've seen, and it emphasizes the trend. So that's bog roll, in other words. Next, please. So looking back at our axis here, and I will put the sociology to one side at some point fairly soon, this is where we want to explore, okay, this northeast quadrant on my screen, okay. We want to be looking at the discourse and looking at the disruption and seeing if there are opportunities for ourselves in the change. Next, please. I've seen this in a number of ways, and I've identified some of them in general, and then we're going to have a look at some specific things that clients have done. There's obviously been the virus, and we're still suffering from it, and pursuant to that, there have been legislative changes in all manner of legal discourses. And those political changes and the legal changes, which have made us have to do things like go into lockdown and so on and so forth, have created commercial opportunities. And there are 4 of these here. So aside from the NHS testing kits, there have been all manner of personal testing kits, some of which regretfully haven't worked and some of which have, that people have been selling at a great premium on the open market. And so there was a market there which didn't exist before. Likewise, as we move into more of a social environment now where people are going out in public, the face mask, aside from being merely a functional bit of kit, has become an aesthetic statement. So people have started to produce designer and patterned face masks. Julie's got one on her teddy bear there, you can't see that. Likewise, when you've been into a shop, you've had social distancing signage on the floor, and you know, all of these different signs and directions. Somebody makes that and makes money out of that. And finally, now we are becoming more sociable, but our public houses are not open. We've got a rise in barbecues, and everybody's having a barbecue all of a sudden. And I was very pleased to hear that one of my clients has slightly pivoted and is now making some barbecue equipment. And I'm sure that that will be a very successful item. Next, please. So aside from the completely new things, we've had this acceleration of existing trends as well. And I think this is particularly interesting. We've had the growth of online retail, of course, because people haven't been going to the shops But of course, we've been seeing that anyway, and people have been moaning the death of the high street. And I think it's very important that shops think about their online offering now, you know, and address that, because it might be a long time until we get to the high street in droves. Similarly, we've had various aspects of staying at home, so working from home, which of course we're doing now, a lot of us. Video calls have gone from being a business thing to having applications in social life via the House Party app, for example. And they're being used more and more in medical consultations, because hospitals have not been perhaps as welcoming as they otherwise would have been due to the virus. Likewise, due to our being at home, the discourse of mental health has, you know, been further emphasised, and we've all had to deal with the mental health toll which being locked down has inflicted on us. So that discourse, I think, has been more prevalent in the media than it had been. Likewise, we're perhaps more accepting of the need to be tracked and traced now, whereas before that would have come up against civil rights discourse. You know, we're more accepting of that at the moment. And then finally, I think, and this is one that I'm quite interested in, because we've been physically distanced from each other, I think that visual culture has become more important. And so what we see has supplanted, to an extent, tactile culture of touching and so on and so forth. And, you know, touching is now more of a private matter than perhaps it was before. Next, please. So what I want us to do is to collectively, individually, go away and look at these different trends and these different discourses and digest what we read in the media and see whether you can come up with anything that is going to make a difference to your business and take advantage of this constantly shifting normative. Next slide, please. By way of example, I've just pulled out a few things which I'll talk about in general terms that I've seen clients doing. So we've got a company that makes plastic items, you know, they make roadside things for use in roadworks. And they've seen a bit of a drop off. And what they've done is they've retooled several of their machines, and now they're manufacturing PPE out of a similar type of material. More fundamentally, we've seen an engineering company start to look at the rationalization of production lines which make PPE, and they've produced new machines which they're currently marketing around the world. A beauty company has supplemented its supply of cosmetics and waxing materials and whatnots with disinfectant and hygiene products, and they contacted us looking at recipes for disinfectant and so on. One high street retailer is looking to increasingly emphasize its online presence, as per our previous remarks. An online gambling company which had both casino betting and sports betting streams, of course, has seen the dwindling of live sporting events, which luckily will be coming back soon, and so has looked to capitalize on its extant casino gambling products and also its virtual or esports betting products, and has seen a surge in interest in those. A medical devices manufacturer, which was already expert in lungs and the pleural cavity, but also was doing things in other areas as well, like the stomach, for example, has seen a renewed emphasis on the producing of COVID-19 treatment products, such as ventilation products, pneumothorax devices, and so on. And finally, a food distributor has had to rationalize its supply chain in order to efficiently deliver food in response to increased demand. All of these are positive responses to the disruption, and all of these firms are doing very, very well as a result of it. Next slide. So for us, for Birkett Long IP, it's meant that we've been very, very busy. And there have actually been a number of articles in the broadsheet newspapers, or at least on their online equivalents, noticing this upswing in new inquiries for IP practitioners as people transform their own businesses. Next slide. But why? You know, why is that the case? What's it got to do with IP? Well, the thing is if you're having a new idea, then you need to try and assert ownership over it. And as society and politics and the economy are disrupted and we see new territory, and that might be new conceptual territory, it might be new trends, there's all of a sudden these vistas of ideas which you can stake your claim on. And so people have been coming to us looking, and if you'll excuse the pun, to lock down these areas. Next, please. Because with intellectual property assets, you can not only grab territory in the form of a monopoly over the object which you're registering or which you're creating, you can also then, having done that, look to license it in the form of licensing a product or in the form of creating a business which you franchise. And last of all, you can monetize your IP by getting tax breaks on the things protected by it, by, for example, the patent box. Next. As we shift to online, it's of particular importance to think about how you're going to look after those assets. A website being, for example, as or more important than a physical store now. Next, please. And I think also, because intellectual property is a subset of intangible assets, they are things that you can work on at the moment. So a brand is something which is essentially conceptual, and it's not something which you can necessarily reach out and touch in the first instance. And you can spend time developing that at the moment. Likewise, an idea, until it's embodied, is not a physical thing. So as we sit in our homes coming up with new ideas, we can put this IP apparatus around it and obtain them for ourselves. Next, please. Different types of IP may include filing a patent application on a technical product, such as a new item or a new process. And there are many, many areas of science and technology to which patent applications can be applied to, and for which patent applications can be applied. If the thing is more of an aesthetic thing, you may look at obtaining a design registration. It may be that the thing that you don't have is technically new, but it looks better than the older things, and designs will be appropriate then. If it's a brand or a new business, you may wish to protect it via a trademark. And aside from all of those things, there are various unregistered rights, which might be copyright in an artistic work, might be copyright in a literary work, or maybe an unregistered design right in the way an industrial product looks, or a specific right in the shape of a circuit board. Next. So if you do have those new ideas, I'd be really pleased to hear from you, and so would my colleagues. We're used to working with disruptive and new technologies, and it'll be a privilege to help you in your disruptive response to the current disruption we're going through. So thank you very much for listening today.
Thanks, Jonathan. This is what was making Jonathan laugh. Also, just to pick up on Jonathan's point in relation to barbecues, I was talking to a client 2 or 3 weeks ago, and he'd promised his family a barbecue, and he couldn't actually find a barbecue anywhere at all because they'd all been sold out. So hopefully your client who's pivoted, Jonathan, will be able to rake in the money, so to speak. Also, just to give a real-time example of pivoting as a consequence of the situation in which we are all finding ourselves and the likely issues that we are anticipating business will be facing in the future. My team is itself pivoting, and we are looking to put together online a series of resources that are specifically dedicated to issues around redundancy, changing terms and conditions, and flexible working, to name but a few that we're working on at the moment. So watch this space for what is to come into the future. Now, just before we move into questions, just a reminder that we will be sending out a recording and a copy of the notes that I've been referring to during the course of my presentation. A reminder, please, to complete the feedback when you get that survey through as well. We are really keen to make sure that the webinars that we are providing hit the mark for you and that you enjoy them. So please do give us your comments and thoughts. Next week's webinar is a complete change of topic. So my colleagues Karen Johnson and Muntek Kaur are going to be talking through co-parenting and supporting families following separation. And as you can see, I think that's a list of the others that we've got already in the pipeline for you, and we are planning for our future series into the future. So again, if you've any ideas or suggestions of topics you'd like to cover, let us know. Please do follow the link there, and you'll be able to register for anything that takes your interest. So across to Sarah, I think, who's going to be putting some questions to Jonathan and myself. So if there are any, in fact.
There is, Julie. I have a couple for you, so I'll start with you if that's okay. First one being, when making staff redundant, at what number do you need to report to the Secretary of State? Is it for 20 plus staff, for even for 1 or 2, please?
It is 20. The magic number is 20, and it's at a, well, it's called an establishment in the legislation, but very broadly speaking, it's a particular place of work. So as I say, in Birkett Long's example, our Colchester office, Chelmsford office, Basildon office. So it's 20 is the key number.
Lovely. Another question was, I noticed that the information concerning redundancy was applicable to employees. Is there any protection for workers?
No, employees will be entitled, well, it's only employees that have protection against unfair dismissal. So they're the ones you would need to worry about in terms of process and the reason for dismissal. It's also only employees who would be entitled to a statutory redundancy payment. But I would exercise a degree of caution, because sometimes individuals might phrase themselves as workers, or the employer might treat them as workers, but in fact they are employees, and you might find they later try and argue that they were, and that's the same whether they're self-employed or indeed agency staff. There's always the risk of that argument in the future.
Thank you. One more. How to deal with meetings whilst in lockdown and working from home?
Okay, so the ACAS has published a guide in relation to, in particular, I think it's disciplinary and grievance meetings. We are being discouraged at the current moment in time from meeting in person unless we can socially distance and put in place appropriate health and safety. So my recommendation has been over the past X weeks of lockdown is to ensure, to use the online meeting facilities that have suddenly come to the fore. I will be honest and say I had never heard of Zoom prior to the 23rd of March, and by the following week I'd already presented an event via Zoom, and then I had that was on the Wednesday, so we went into lockdown on the Sunday. On the Wednesday I was using Zoom for a presentation, and by the Friday I'd used Teams as well. So there's lots of things out there and lots of ways of communicating and meeting without being in the same physical space. And Jonathan mentioned, I think, house party, never heard of it, but yes, there's lots of things out there that will help with that, and I would encourage you use video rather than phone if you can.
Thank you, Julie. Now I'm going to have a question for Jonathan. Jonathan, how do you spot whether an opportunity has an IP protection need, and at what point do we need to talk to someone like you?
Well, I think if we're looking at new opportunities, the assumption has to be that it's worth having a chat. As I said in my last slide, if your thing is of a technical nature, it may be that you want a patent application out of it. It may be that if it's a new brand, you may want to file a trademark, or if it's something that has aesthetic appeal, there may be a design registration to be made. But really, if it's something that feels new to you, it's worth a chat. And we won't tend to charge for chat, because we want to get to know you. So really, anytime.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions we have for today. Any direct questions, we'll be getting Jonathan and Julie to reply tomorrow directly. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. So just to re-emphasise the point there that Jonathan has made, all of our solicitors within Birkett Long would be delighted to hear from you if you have a query. We don't start the clock running from the very first second that we pick up the phone. We're very happy to talk to you on a no obligation basis, just to talk through the particular issue and see if it's something that we might be able to help you with. And you will only ever be charged once you've been told what those charges are going to be. So don't worry about picking up the phone. We'd much rather ask, you ask some general questions and go away with a good steer on what sort of thing to do, even if it doesn't mean that you instruct us at the other side. So without any more ado, I think this is the first time I've actually finished in time in my life. So I will say thank you to you all on behalf of Jonathan and myself and Birkett Long, and I will wish you a very good day. Thank you for joining us. Please do get in touch with Jonathan or myself or any of our colleagues if we can help. Thank you.